Well, welcome back, brave ones. So in this part of the lecture, we're going to walk through some of the most well-known classic studies in all of psychology. I hope that you will be able to see in these studies how provocative and insightful and unique they are. As we walk through chapter 13 that takes us through social thinking, social influence, and social relationships. Let's get started. Okay, so where we last left off, we were talking about persuasion, and persuasion is part of social influence. So in 1951, Solomon Asch, a researcher, wanted to determine how people were affected by the thoughts and behaviors of other people. You'll find that post-World War II, many researchers wanted to understand how is it that people could go along with bad behaviors, evil behaviors, the Holocaust, war. How could this happen? So there was, after World War II, very understandably, an increase in the desire to have psychological understanding about human behavior and mental processes. In one of Asch's classic experiments, he had a group of participants shown a series of printed line segments of different lengths. He would show them first the display of the 3 lines, A, B, and C. They were then shown a 4th segment, and that would be like the other line that's on the left-hand side. And their task was simply this. They were then asked to identify which line segment from the first group, A, B, or C, was the closest to the 4th line, or the comparative line. So what's the answer, guys? A, B, or C? As you can see, it's pretty obvious what the answer should be. There isn't uncertainty about the correct answer. It's a pretty clear task. Now, each group of participants had only one true participant. The remaining members of the group in which the participant was placed were all confederates or actors of the researcher. A confederate is a person who is aware of the experiment and works for the researcher. So in Asch's experiment, you walk in, you're going to do this line task. You sit in a room with other participants. They're all there for the experiment. Now, we know that they're confederates and there's just one participant in there, but the participant doesn't know that. So the participant is near the tail end of the answer line. He's normally, I think, like person number 6 or something. So in the experiment, you essentially are given this line task, and you're just going to answer publicly after all the people go. So the first person goes, the second person, third, fourth, fifth, and then you go, and then someone else goes. You're basically giving your answers to this line task. Now, here's the interesting thing. On 12 of the 18 times that you do this line task, the confederates are answering the wrong answer. So they might be B, B, B. So in Asch's study, what happens is 12 out of the 18 times, those other participants that you think are participants but are actually confederates, they identify the wrong line, like a line segment that's obviously not the correct answer. And what the dependent variable of the Asch study is whether or not the participant conforms to the group answer, which is clearly wrong, or if they give a non-conforming but accurate answer about the line segment. So how often do you think the participant goes along with the group? Well, Asch found that 76% of participants conform to group pressure at least once by indicating the incorrect line. And when you think about it, that's actually really provocative. This is not a task in which it's unclear what the answer is. The answer is very clear. And how do we know that it's very clear? Asch did this same experiment with participants, and those participants did not have anyone else in the room. And the accuracy rate for those participants that had no social influence whatsoever was more than 99%. Like, the task is very easy and very clear. So we can be certain that it's not that the participants are unsure and the task is hard and they're just looking to other people to sort of get the right answer because they don't know. They know what the right answer is. They're just going along with the crowd. And going along with the crowd is essentially conformity. Conformity is the change in a person's behavior to go along with the group, even if he doesn't agree with the group. So you might be saying to yourself, okay, 76% of participants go along at least once with the wrong answer. What's the big deal? Well, if going along with the wrong answer was being a jury on a murder case, that might be a very big deal. If deciding on who you hire or who you give the scholarship to ended up going along with the wrong answer, that might be a very big deal. There's many group decisions and many decisions, you guys, that are not as trivial as which line is longest. So I don't want you guys to think that this is in any way a small finding. It's a very huge finding because the people in this experiment know what the right answer is, but they're valuing the group affiliation and going along with the group more than accuracy and truth. So what factors make a person more likely to yield to that group pressure? Research shows that the size of the majority, the presence of another dissenter, and the public or relatively private nature of a person's responses are key influences on conformity. So the greater number of people there are in the majority, the more likely it is that a person will conform. Interestingly, the presence of another person in the room that dissents, even if that other dissenter gives a wrong answer, but it's just a different answer than what the group said, even one dissenting person in the room with you will allow you to be non-conforming and give the accurate answer. And also, when responses are made publicly in front of others, conformity is more likely. But when those same responses are made privately, conformity is less likely. So what are the psychological factors that lead people to conform? Well, the two motivational factors here that have to do with conformity are informational influence and normative influence. Informational social influence has to do with the desire to gain information to be correct, the desire to be right. So people will sometimes conform because they don't know what the right answer is, essentially. So they go along because they don't really know which restaurant is the best, or they go along because they don't exactly know what they should be doing in the group presentation right now. I guess I'll do whatever's assigned to me. You know, they're going along because it looks like other people have the information that they don't. Now, in Ash's study, the information is quite clear. So in the case of the Ash study, they're not lacking information about the situation. So their conformity in the Ash study has to be described by normative social influence. And normative social influence has to do with the desire to be liked and to be part of a crowd and to be fitting in and belonging. So sometimes you go along with the crowd because you need information and it looks like other people have it. And some other times you go along with the crowd because the crowd is doing it, and to not do it would make you not part of the group and that would feel bad. So you'll just give the wrong answer so that you can be unanimous. Part of the reason that it's not surprising that we see these findings is that your brain actually really likes going along. It likes going along. It actually rewards you for belonging to a group. So you'll see that oxytocin, a neurotransmitter and hormone that has to do with getting along and social connection and bonding, that actually promotes conformity because it actually feels really good and you bond and are able to have a sense of liking and affiliation when you are in a group that's doing the same thing. Recent fMRI studies also show that your brain sometimes considers non-conforming actions to be like making a mistake or making an error. And nobody likes to make a mistake or an error. It doesn't feel good, right? So perhaps in both the reward circuitry and the error navigating part of your brain, where you're sort of scanning for whether or not you've made mistakes, conformity allows your brain to actually go, yeah, we're doing the right thing. So we have some biological hardwired basics that bring us into life with a set point for conforming. And that being said, you guys, conformity is not always bad. It's not always good either. When I was talking about social influence, I said it had sort of two sides, right? So you have persuasion can either be good by way of mentorship and education and growth, or persuasion can be negative in the sense of peer pressure or seduction or manipulation. The concept of social influence is neither good nor bad. It can be either, depending on the application. And the same thing is true of conformity. Conformity is going along with the group. Now, there's plenty of ways in which going along with the group is very helpful. If you follow the speed limit, or you put your seatbelt on, or you brush your teeth, or you stand in line, there's many things that we conform to that are appropriate. You wore clothes during class, right? I mean, like you attended school with clothing, so that's good, right? You conformed to that standard. I don't remember any class where anybody literally stood up and started singing the alphabet loudly or screamed or had an air horn and was like, pew, 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 pew. You know, I mean, although that would be pretty hilarious, but you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm sure your other students would really appreciate not being interrupted. So you conformed to sitting in the chair during lecture. You conformed to taking a test and not interrupting other people. Like, there's lots of things that are good in regard to going along. But the other side of that coin has to do with the fact that there are situations in which going along is not good. So going along with a bad decision when you know it's a bad decision and it's potentially going to hurt somebody or not be truthful or not be the right thing, that's not good. Saying yes to something that you don't want to say yes to because you don't want to be disliked by other people, that's not good. So we just need to remember that the context determines whether something is going to be good conformity or harmful conformity. An interesting finding about conformity is that you see higher levels of conforming behavior in collectivist societies, societies that are not individualist but more honor-based, familial, ancestral, really about like respect for elders and group behaviors and don't stand out. Those cultures quite understandably put a premium on conforming behaviors because conformity is seen as a sign of reverence and respect, and there are strong social pressures for that conformity. And again, I remind you that conformity is neither good nor bad. It depends on the situation. Another really classic study shows forth this same double-sided issue of social influence, and that is the concept of obedience. Now, obedience is essentially conforming to the explicit request of a person in authority or a person that's making an explicit demand of you. Now, you're obedient to a lot of things every day, whether it is following the law or following the instructions of a caregiver or a professor or a coach or somebody above you. Let me give you an example. We don't want little kids to run out in the middle of the street while they're playing. Why? Because cars go by and they might get hurt, right? So we do want kids to be able to know how to obey the rules. In this case, obedience is really important because it's for their safety. So when the authority is making decisions based on what is good and safe and healthy, obedience can, in general, be good and safe and healthy, if that is the general motive of the reason for requiring that obedience. But we all know that there are controlling and dark and not nice people that try to use their authority for wrong purposes. I would love to say that you guys are going to have lives that involve authority figures all the time, everywhere you go, every cop you meet, every professor you have, every boss you have, all of your family members, all of your elders. I would love for it to be a world in which all the people above you, all the authority above you were righteous and moral and ethical and kind and had your best interest in heart. But you and I both know that we don't live in a world with perfect leaders. In the 1960s, when they were having the trials for some of the Nazi scientists, one of the scientists, Adolf Eichmann, had mentioned that his reason for doing all those terrible things to the Jews and other people that suffered so greatly under the total pathology and pure evil of that leadership is Eichmann said that he was just following orders. He was just, these things happened. He did these things because he was just told to. He was following orders. Stanley Milgram comes alongside and hears that statement and goes, "Oh my gosh, what?" So what was happening in America as those reports of all the atrocities continued to come out, a lot of Americans were thinking to themselves, this would never happen here. Americans would never do that. How could that happen over there? Who are these people over there, right? So there's this thought of like, that's something that other people would do wrong, but I wouldn't make that mistake. And Milgram was hearing it even from his own college and university professionals, that people don't really behave like that, that must be something about the German people, that it was a unique experience. And Milgram wasn't entirely sure. So Stanley Milgram creates what is the most classic study in all psychology. I think it's pretty safe to say that of all the studies that I could share with you, this is one that I hope that you remember. So Stanley Milgram is unsure about the fact that his colleagues and a lot of Americans around him at the time are saying that the atrocities that happened in World War II would never happen in America. Something in Milgram's gut tells him that there's something foundationally human going on in the just following orders. He creates a situation, a very strong situation, where he can test whether or not people would be likely to conform with an authority figure that's asking them to hurt another person. Now, before he even does this experiment, he describes that experiment to a lot of psychiatrists and psychologist friends of his, people connected in the academic world, people that are very well educated. So he explains the experiment to them. So I'm going to explain it to you so that you can hear what these psychiatrists and very trained professionals were hearing. He says, okay, I'm going to have a guy in a white lab coat, and this is Yale University, so Yale plus white lab coat, university, that's definitely an authority figure, right? So I'm going to have my experimenter in a white lab coat, and he's going to greet two participants in the waiting room of a lab. And the experimenter is going to come out and say, hey, so we're doing a study on learning and memory. We want to see if consequence helps a person learn a word list. what I'd like you guys to do is reach into this hat and you're going to pick out the role. One of you is going to be the learner to learn the words, and the other one of you is going to be the teacher to help teach the learner the word list. Now, the participant doesn't know this, but what happens is the participant is always going to get the teacher role because the learner that's in the room with them in the waiting room, he's a confederate of the experimenter. He's always going to get the learner role because he's not a real participant. You just think he is because he arrives at the same time as you and he's being talked to like a participant. He's a participant. So you get the role of a teacher, and before you start, the learner does some introductions and the learner mentions, hey, and the learner says, hey, I have a heart condition. Nothing that we're about to do is going to be bad for that, right? And the experimenter says, no, everything that we're going to do is totally safe. Let me walk you through the process. So you walk over to another room, and what you see is that there's a little shock board, and it goes from 15 volts, slight shock, all the way up to 450 volts, XXX. And so the experimenter says, all right, so we're going to attach the learner to this little electrode machine. And every time the learner gets an answer wrong, we're going to deliver a slight little electrical shock to them. And to make the experiment feel more authentic, you both get to experience the slight shock, the little tiny little shock. It's nothing. And that feels real. It feels like convincing. So the experimenter in the white lab coat says, okay, learner, I'm going to strap you into this machine and give you a word list to memorize. You're going to do that. And I'm going to take the teacher over to the other room and we're going to get ready for you. And so you go, okay, that's the setup. So you leave the learner. He's in the room right next to you. You can't see him, but you can hear him. And you saw him strapped in and ready to go. You walk over to the next room and the experimenter sits behind you. In front of you is a shock board, like I mentioned, with 15 all the way up to 450. You give a little time to the learner to learn the word list in such a way as you get to see that the shock board, every time you do one, it sort of compresses and it stays down. So you're going to be, with every wrong answer of the learner, you're going to be progressing up the voltage level. And this picture on the slide shows what the labels were for 15 all the way up to 450. So the experimenter, when things start, gives word pairs and gives words out to test the memory of the learner. And the learner gets some of them right and some of them wrong. So the dependent variable is how far up the shock board the participant, the teacher, goes. That is the classic iteration or the classic study setup. So before even doing the experiment, Milgram told psychiatrists, psychologists, colleagues, professionals, medical doctors, he proposed this study to them and he asked them, how many of my participants, according to your medical and professional and psychiatric and psychological opinion, how many of them are going to go all the way to the end of my shock board? The average estimate of the people that knew human behavior and human pathology the most, their estimate when average was 1 out of every 1,000 people would be that pathological, quote unquote, to go that far in Milgram's experiment. But do you know how many people actually went that far? Nearly 2/3 of his participants, 65% of them, went all the way to the end of the shock board. His gut feeling about human nature was right, that there was a tremendous influence of obedience. So let's describe a little bit about what happens and what made people go that far. So I told you the setup of the experiment. So you can imagine being the teacher and you have the experimenter behind you, you have the shock board in front of you. And you've got the learner giving some right answers and some wrong answers. Well, it starts out kind of okay because the shocks aren't that painful. So the guy's making some mistakes, but you're just down on the lower levels. When it starts to get stronger, the learner, however, starts saying, ow. At 150 volts, though, the learner demands to stop the experiment. He wants to stop. At 180, he's crying out and screaming that he can't stand it. At 300 volts, he is in agony and says, hey, my heart condition, my heart condition. He brings that up again. And after 300 volts, he just stops responding. 65% of the participants in this study go all the way to the end, despite the fact that the learner has said, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to be here. It hurts so bad I can't stand it. I have a heart condition. And at some point, literally stops responding, and you sort of hear like a thud, so it's assumed that maybe he's passed out or he's hurt. People even continue shocking a non-responsive person in this iteration. And why do they do it? The experimenter in the white lab coat has a couple phrases that he says, but one of them is quite clear. You must go on. The experiment requires that you continue. The experimenter does not get out of the chair. He just has a few phrases. Please continue. You must go on. That's the limit of the authority power, is just a few statements from the authority person there. Now you might think to yourself, that would never happen today. You know, that's been said before. That would never happen here, or that would never happen today. In 2006, a researcher by the name of Berger did a replication that was quite similar to the Milgram experiment. The difference was that the experiment essentially stopped at 150 volts. It didn't continue all the way to the end. Now, the reason for that is, number one, ethically, Milgram's experiment is definitely outside of what we would do in a research setting. But also, most of the people that disobeyed in Milgram's experiment did so at that 150 volt level. So when the learner in the other room says, hey, I don't want to do this anymore, I want to stop, 80% of those that disobey do so at that 150 volt level. So Berger's replication essentially goes to that 150 volt level. So since we have data on Milgram's, the number of people that got that far, and Berger's, we should be able to compare whether or not it's true that people would never do that anymore. And you know what? The findings are not that different. The replication shows that there are similar results of being willing to continue on, similar numbers. What does this mean? This means, you guys, that authority has tremendous social influence. So what are some factors that contribute to obedience or disobedience? Well, Milgram didn't just do one experiment. He did many, many, many experiments where he slightly changed the setting. In one of the settings, he did it not at Yale University. He did it at like a learning annex down the road, you know, just like a real humble location. In the really humble location, the number of people that went all the way to the end was a little bit fewer. He did another replication in which the authority figure was not in the same room. And in that way, the number of participants that were willing to go all the way to 450 decreased. In another replication, the learner was actually in the room with you, and you had to hold their hand down on the shock plate as you shocked them. And that also had the number of people that went all the way to 450 decrease, as you can imagine. But the largest decrease in that full obedience all the way to 450 was a replication that involved another participant as being with you during the experiment. You think he's like another teacher. And when the other participant declines to continue and says, no, I don't want to do this anymore, I'm out, I don't care I don't care. When there's a dissenter, that's when people just go, okay, no, I don't want to do this either. So when you have a non-conforming peer that you can be non-conforming with and disobedient with, you are less likely to go along with the authority figure's promptings. You must continue. You know what I think is really interesting about that? That shows me that sometimes when you're in situations where there's bad things going on and it seems like all hope is lost, you don't need a big group. You just need at least one other, right? The power of two, pretty important. So in a situation that might be an emergency or something is evil or something's not right, you might feel like, what am I going to do? There's so many things here. There's so many people here. There's so much going on. I'm just one person. You don't need to change every mind. You just need to, at the very least, find another dissenter, find someone else that's going to stand the ground with you. And believe it or not, a lot can change that way. Another thing that's important to note here is that you should expect your leaders and authority members to be ethical and for the good guys to be good. In another very classic study of obedience, we have Zimbardo's prison experiment. Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment happens in 1971. And Zimbardo is also very interested in the nature of like good and evil and social influence and social psychology. How do people influence one another? How do we make decisions? Right? Trying to understand why people do what they do. So what Zimbardo does is he intends to do a 2-week simulation, like a role play, where there's going to be guards and prisoners. He's going to get 24 participants and they're going to be men and they're going to agree to 2 weeks of being part of a role play that he's going to randomly assign them. And he does, he randomly assigns them into 2 different groups, guards and prisoners. And essentially in the basement of the Stanford psychology department, they're going to play out this role play. The guards are going to have sunglasses and wooden batons and handcuffs and belts and sort of like a uniform, like a guard uniform. They're going to look like security guards, look like guards. And the prisoners are going to be wearing basically like a prison outfit with a prison cap, and they're going to have a number assigned to them. The guards are going to work sort of normal shifts and come and go. And the prisoners are going to be in cells, very much like a prison. Well, this is not a production, and the people very quickly, the situation spirals out of control. So out of control that Zimbardo has to terminate the study after 6 days. And to be honest, he probably should have ended it way before that. Part of the thing, if you hear Zimbardo ever talk about it, he talks about how even he got totally wrapped up in the power and the control and the entire allure of the role play. And the guards absolutely start to lose their grip on who they are. They started manifesting aggression and emotional abuse, and they started dehumanizing the prisoners. They would call them names. They would have them pretend that they were Frankenstein and go ahead and give the bride of Frankenstein a kiss. And they were like, the footage of it is actually really hard to watch because the guards themselves tremendously went along with the power dynamic. The prisoners also started to lose their sense of sanity and safety and wellness, and they became rebellious at one point and like barricaded themselves in. There were some strange behaviors. All in all, a very bizarre and unhealthy situation. And an experiment like this would not happen today. It would not pass the ethical standards of being able to use human participants. And I think it speaks a lot about the power of social influence. So we see a few things. We see when people play roles, sometimes the roles can become a little bit bigger than we had intended. We can also see that sometimes power can corrupt in that way. And we can also see the effects of what happens when you take prisoners and you sort of take their identity away. They're not called by their names anymore. They're now numbers, and they're not even sort of a person. They're like an object or a number. And that's not good for their health in any way. And de-individuation is what happens when a person's personal identity decreases and their group identity and anonymity inside of that group increase. It can be dangerous because it can reduce personal responsibility and reduce inhibitions because people have given themselves over to group roles. So belonging to groups is important, you guys. But it's important that no matter what group you're in, whether that group is a family or a sorority or a fraternity or a church or a group of friends or a job or a major or a workplace, whatever that group is, it's really important that you don't lose the fact that you're accountable for your actions while in that group. That you see yourself very clearly, yes, I'm part of a group, but I'm also me within this group. So let's talk some more about that process of de-individuation. So de-individuation is a special type of group influence. It's what happens when you're part of a group that has you have the group role or the group membership be above your individual person. So you're part of this group and the group is your identity. What can happen in situations like that is you can see an erosion of your own personal or individual identity, and therefore, unfortunately, some erosion of your personal accountability or responsibility for your actions. This is especially true if you are somehow anonymous within this group setting. And you might be asking, like, well, wait, what do you mean anonymous? Well, on Halloween, people wear costumes, right? They wear masks where sometimes people behave in Halloween when they're dressed up and they're at a party and they've got a costume on. They're not really themselves anymore. They're now part of kind of the group setting. A costume or a uniform or something that we're all wearing that can't distinguish me from sort of other people per se might be one way that I'm a little bit more anonymous. It's not me uniquely anymore. It's just there's a whole bunch of people wearing the same outfit. If you're anonymous or you're in a situation where it's less likely for you to be sort of individually singled out, people feel disinhibited from behaving in some impulsive, indulgent, and sometimes even aggressive ways. So I would love to say that being part of a group always leads to good things. And you guys, sometimes being part of a group absolutely leads to good things. If all of us are together building a house for Habitat for Humanity, or we're all singing in a choir together and doing something special together, or our family is together and having a really constructive time together as a group, groups are neither good nor bad. The context matters. In your life, you're going to have to navigate your group identity and your individual identity. You're going to have workplaces and affiliations and groups of people that carry your purpose and passion and part of who you are. And I would expect, being young people, you're going to see a lot of different things in your life, things that you are ready for and things that you didn't expect. Because you're a human and you're surrounded by humans, and I'm a human too, there's going to be times that you have leaders and coaches and teachers and people over you like bosses and authorities that are fair, moral, ethical, wonderful, and want the very best for you. And sometimes Some of those people might not want the best for you, or they might not be the best, most ethical leader. I can guarantee you that you're going to see a variety of those things in your workplace, in your family, in your friend group, because there's humans around you, right? So what's the lesson? The lesson is that you are absolutely accountable for what you do when you're in a group. And you don't need a whole troop of people to still be a leader. So sometimes you need to be the first person in the group that says, hey, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm done. So if that's speaking to something in you right now, I just want to encourage you, be the good guy. You know what the good guy looks like, right? So in the Milgram experiment, they know that this guy wants out of the experiment, and they know that this doesn't feel right. So I'm done. I'm done with the experiment. That's the right call, right? What is a hero to do in this situation? If I was the best good guy that I could possibly be, if I was the hero in this story here, what does the hero do? Not that I'm holding myself to a perfect standard, because no, we don't aim for perfection. We aim for purpose, right? And my purpose is to be a hero and to raise up other heroes. So if you're hearing my voice right now, you guys, you're hearing someone that wants you so bad to be all that you were meant to be brave, to be courageous, and to be the hero in your story. And the hero is the good guy, right? Whew, that made me emotional. You guys just get my heart all the time. You have my heart. Okay, so let's move forward here and talk a little bit more about group influence. So there are two different dynamics here that have to do with your performance while you're in a group. We talked about de-individuation, about you kind of losing a sense of yourself. And when you lose a sense of self, it looks like your inhibitions are lowered, and sometimes you can do things that you would have never done otherwise under those de-individuated circumstances. What are some dynamics when it comes to group performance under regular circumstances, non-de-individuated circumstances? Well, two potential possibilities: social facilitation or social loafing. Being part of a group can either help your performance, social facilitation, or facilitate it, or it can hurt your performance in such a way as you do less or you perform at a lower level, social loafing. Well, social facilitation has to do with the fact that in some groups, when you're in a group, you perform better. You often perform better when you're in a group setting when you are alert and you're doing tasks that you have learned very well or you have a good bearing on. So for example, a basketball player that is a very good basketball player often will do better with a crowd because that crowd has hyped you up. And since you're really practiced at what you do, being hyped up just kind of actually makes you maximum performance, right? Maximum effort. You're just like, you're at the top of your game. Now, we all know, however, that sometimes if maybe you're not the best basketball player yet and a group is around, your performance could diminish because it's socially inhibited by the crowd setting. The crowd setting adds arousal to you, and the arousal is distracting to you and minimizes your performance. So despite the fact that you sing beautifully in the shower, once other people are around, you can't perform at that level because now you're worrying about performing and it's not as very practiced, and gosh, it sounded better in the shower, and right? So what's the lesson here? The lesson here is that oftentimes on well-learned tasks, the crowd environment will amplify or socially facilitate your performance. if it is something that you are comfortable with. You can handle the arousal, you can handle the extra inputs, and it can bring you to a better performing level. With a task that is less ready or less prepared, or maybe you're less confident on it, you will often be inhibited by the presence of other people, because the presence of other people will either be distracting or you will be worried. We call it evaluation apprehension. You'll be worried about being evaluated negatively. Another type of group dynamic or group influence has to do with something called social loafing. And social loafing is something that you've all seen. I know you've seen this because all of you have had group presentations before. You ever part of a group and there are members that literally disappear, where it's like, hello, are you in our group anymore? Are you even in the class anymore? Social loafing is what happens sometimes when in a group task, there is reduced individual accountability, and that reduced accountability for individual members means that some of those members will stop working, or they'll reduce their workload, or they'll slow down considerably. So if I'm part of a group of 5 and the 5 of us just need to write this paper, we're going to write one paper and turn it in. If I'm not individually writing one section and getting a grade for my section, but we're just doing one paper and getting one grade, you're going to have some people free ride. They're going to be free riders. They're just going to ride on what other people do to gain the benefit of what the other people in the group have done to perform. Social loafing happens in group dynamics all the time, especially when a group goal is just like, we just need to get this done as a group. Well, not every member of the group is at maximum efficiency, right? So if you're ever in charge of a group of people, do your very best to call out individually what they're doing and evaluate them individually on their progress. That way they know that they're not getting lost in the group and their contributions, or lack thereof, matter. In talking about groups, I want to talk about something else called group polarization. So group polarization is something that happens in groups as well. And that is when a group oftentimes can accelerate or amplify in such a way as to make its group members actually go to more extreme decisions than they would if they were making those decisions by themselves. Okay, so we know about group polarization on account of a finding called the risky shift. The risky shift is essentially this. So in a risky shift scenario, you're given information about a person or a decision, and then asked to make a percentage, essentially, like, what's the percentage likelihood that you should make this decision or that decision? So you'll have like a risk analysis, essentially, of, should I make this decision 7 times out of 10? Should I make this decision maybe only once out of 10? You'll have some idea about the risk reward, or, like the balance of how you decide a decision. So you have these scenarios, and you'll have therefore a number in accordance with what you think that decision should be in regard to risk. So, okay, 6 times out of 10, you should take the risk on that one. That one, I don't know, 1 time out of 10, that's too risky. So you'll have scenarios, and each of them will have sort of a number attached to it. What the risky shift is when you do those scenarios, those same scenarios with the same numerical risk indicators, when you do the scenarios with groups of other people, other people in a group that discuss that same scenario, just like you, they're just people like you. They're not confederates of the experimenter, but they're just other people discussing the same scenario. When people discuss scenarios together, they tend to make a risky shift. They will often shift their decision making in the direction of more risk. So whereas alone, you would have said, oh, I don't think that person should do that. Like maybe 50-50, maybe only 5 times out of 10 they should try that. I don't really feel very confident about that. But when you've discussed it in a group of other people, for some reason, in the group setting, the average and your decision tends to shift up to 8 times out of 10 you should make the decision. That is the risky shift. And that's often what happens when groups make decisions together. We know about group polarization and have studied group polarization on account of finding those risky shift results consistently in the research. So group polarization is what happens when a discussion in a group actually makes the group make a more extreme decision than any of its individual members would have done had they decided individually. What's the application to the real world? Well, the real world is that your friends probably do this all the time. You've intended to just give 1 hour to socializing with your friends. But once your friends are all together, it's become 1 hour, plus we're going to go see a movie, plus we're going to hang out later. So you intended to do 1 hour, but it's now turned into 7 hours. Once we're in a group and we're emboldened by the presence of one another, it's almost like the group dynamic makes us feel powerful, like we can take on more risk now that we're together. If you want to make decisions, though, you sometimes have to go back and be like, okay, let me make this decision individually, and then we'll all bring in our individual assessments and go from there. Another very unique group dynamic is something called groupthink. And groupthink is a particular and specific situation in which a group makes a bad decision together because it's valuing group harmony over accuracy and safety of a decision. Oftentimes in a groupthink dynamic, what's happening is there's often a leader that is strongly directing or expecting something to happen. There's often a second person within that group that's kind of like the bulldog or the bad cop that is like allowing the leader to stay the good guy, but also there's a number 2 person that's kind of the bad cop, and they're patrolling the room and making sure that nobody disagrees, right? And there's really strong social pressures in a groupthink situation. And because the leader is highly directive, and sometimes the leader is actually quite inspirational, and also there is a mind guard or a person that's in the group that's keeping the group focused on what the leader wants, sometimes groups will make very poor decisions because they're going along with the dynamic of the group rather than making a safe decision as an individual within a group. So groupthink is the modification of the opinions of members of a group to align with what they think or believe is the group consensus. In group situations, the group often takes action that individuals would not perform outside of the group setting because groups often make more extreme decisions than individuals do. Groupthink is such a strong and unique group pressure that it actively hinders opposing lines of thought or dissenting or disagreeing opinions. This elimination of diverse opinions or dissenting opinions can contribute to the bad decision making by the group. Well, there are several symptoms of groupthink, including perceiving the group as invulnerable or invincible. This means that the group has might and right, that believing that the group is on the right course or is highly moral is also a symptom of a groupthink situation. You'll also see self-censorship by the group members in such a way as people will know, I shouldn't bring that up. I'm going to withhold that information because if I bring that up, it's going to disrupt the group consensus and the group dynamic. A groupthink situation very actively puts down dissenting group members' opinions. so that if somebody tries to take like a different view, they're going to get shut down really quick. Why we would see that quashing or that subduing of dissenting voices is that in a groupthink situation, people often pander and try very hard to shield the leader from any disagreement. They don't want to show the leader that the group is not on the quote unquote same page. And honestly, whenever I hear anybody be like, hey, we need to get on the same page, I'm always like, okay. What I'd rather hear from a leader is that my leader wants, hey guys, I want to talk about its strengths and its weaknesses. Go. Another symptom of groupthink is having a perception that the group is unanimous in its opinions. False consensus, right? And also holding stereotypes or negative attitudes towards the outgroup or the bad guys or the other team or the other workplace or the other business or anybody with differing viewpoints. When the group is highly cohesive, has a strong sense of connection, or has maintaining group harmony as its main goal, sometimes a group like that might consider harmony within the group as being more important than making well-rounded, accurate, or sound decisions. If the group leader is directive and makes her opinions very clearly known, this may discourage group members from disagreeing with the leader, especially in a group in which cohesion and being on the same page are the high-value priority. If this group is isolated from hearing alternative or disagreeing or new viewpoints, groupthink might be even more likely. So what's a thought here, you guys? Leadership is absolutely important, and respecting leaders is important. But well-rounded leaders don't need to be pandered to. You want to follow people that can talk about strengths and weaknesses in a very rational, well-rounded way. You'll be safer in a group and make better decisions when you're surrounded by people that feel free to express their opinion. Because we're humans and sometimes we agree and sometimes we don't. We want to have new information. We want to have new viewpoints. We want to have new data so we can edit what we're doing to be appropriate for the season that we're in. So how can we avoid groupthink? Well, there are several strategies that can improve group decision making, and they include seeking outside opinions, voting on decisions in private rather than in public, having a leader sort of withhold their opinion or their position statements until all of the group members have spoken, conducting research on all viewpoints, or basically asking a question like this. If this decision that we're about to make fails in 6 months, what was the reason that it failed? Like, tell me what would happen if we're making the wrong decision. Give me the analysis that way. This tells people that, like, hey, we're not perfect. Is this the right decision? If it's not the right decision, what are the reasons for it? Let's look for some of the weaknesses in the plan to make sure that we are balancing ourselves. You want to weigh the costs and benefits of all opinions. And you want to have a backup plan for a good decision. A good decision is going to have a what if contingency, right? So if possible, especially with a decision that you have the ability to have some time on, at least a day, have that discussion as a group and then double back the next day. Go ahead and let people sleep on it. Let them reflect on it. Let them think about it a little bit more. Because sometimes the social pressure of making a decision, people wanted to speak up, they wanted to say things, but they didn't feel empowered to do so. But since they slept on it and they thought about it and they weren't caught off guard anymore, when they're able to come back into a meeting, they go, I thought about it and I actually don't think it's a decision that we should do at this time because... So you give people freedom when you give them a little bit of time to process too. Have you ever been in a groupthink situation? Okay, as we move forward towards the tail end of this chapter, let's review where we've been. So we're talking about social psychology, and we know that the three main things in social psychology have to do with social thinking, that's social cognition, social influence, which we just talked about pretty extensively, and the last factor, social relations or social relationships. Social psychology also has a heart for understanding how people affiliate with one another and how they work well together, but also what happens when we don't work so well together. In social psychology, we consider prejudice to be an unjustified negative attitude, we see that word again, toward a group and its members. Now, that unjustified attitude, over the years, what we're seeing in the research of prejudice and discrimination and racism is that, at least in America, explicit measures and explicit statements of racism, people express them less. So explicit displays of, because they do surveys all the time about social values, prejudice, different groups, those explicit views have diminished. However, there's something that we call implicit attitudes that are underneath the surface and really wouldn't be expressed because we wouldn't want to express those things. They are thoughts and feelings that are implicit. They're a little bit undercover. One of the ways that psychologists at times will assess that implicit categorization is through something called the implicit association test, or the IAT. I would really love for you guys to go to the IAT website. You can take it. It's such a cool test. It wants to see your implicit associations between groups of things. So what are some explanations from a social psychological standpoint for prejudice? One psychological fuel factor for prejudice has to do with competition between groups, especially when those groups are at unequal status and they don't have equity or equality. So competition often promotes prejudice, especially when one group doesn't feel as powerful as the other. Competition for resources between those unequal groups can absolutely be a psychological motivation for unjustified negative attitudes towards a group and its members. Another explanation has to do with learning and observational learning of how we watch the world around us deal with certain groups and their members. We might listen to our parents or listen to music or listen to podcasts or celebrities, or we watch movies and we see images that have certain members treated in certain ways. Another explanation for prejudice has to do with the fact that sometimes prejudice allows a person to enhance their own self-esteem by feeling better than another person or another group. We talked about earlier in social cognition that people are often motivated to protect their self-esteem and keep their self-esteem at a high level. And they will explain behaviors away if it makes their self-esteem feel better. Or they'll blame somebody for their problem if it makes them, the person that's explaining things, feel better about themselves. So we see some attribution theory taking place with prejudice. And another limitation of prejudice has to do with just the nature of our cognitive system. Our cognitive system does operate on heuristics and making quick sort of classification decisions on things. Because if it takes in information and analyzes everything bit by bit by bit slowly, sometimes that slow processing, it slows down our life so much that we can't kind of make quick decisions. So another explanation for prejudice is that sometimes our brain just classifies things very quickly based on what we've learned or what we've seen before, And it's making those decisions not necessarily with malice, but with cognitive speed at hand. So a little bit of terminology here to parse out. And I think it's important to classify this. So prejudicial attitudes have to do with an unjustified opinion, that is a thought, feeling, belief about a group and its members. It's an unfair assessment. Now, the bigger term there that we often use as well, that has a slightly different meaning, is stereotype. Now, a stereotype is something that's a really neutral term. Let me describe to you why it's neutral. Because a stereotype can be good, bad, or neutral. A stereotype is just very much a generalization about a category, a group, or a classification of something. So you can have a stereotype of ice cream, you can have a stereotype of women, you can have a stereotype of red cars, you can have a stereotype of cats and dogs, right? So there can be stereotypical ideas. So a stereotype is essentially just your brain and your cognitive system trying to classify things into groups to make sense of different categories. In Chapter 9, we talked about Piaget and we talked about classification and we talked about little kids starting to learn that okay, zebras are zebras and horses are horses. And gosh, they look a little bit similar. And let's see, is a zebra a horse? Or, trying to make sense of the world in that way. The problem lies, of course, when that generalization about a group leads to negative actions or negative thoughts, or the stereotype is negative. We saw in Self-Fulfilling Prophecy that a negative expectation about a group and its members could lead to some negative performance from those members, or even negative behavior towards those members, which is discrimination. So stereotype has to do with classification, and discrimination has to do with unjustified, negative, or harmful behavior or action. So what can we do to improve relationships among groups of people so we can see less unjustified attitudes or actions? Well, we have decades and decades of research that can give us some answers to these questions. So first and foremost, just putting people in a room and just giving them contact, different groups contact with one another, that's not enough. What needs to happen on top of contact is that contact, it works best if it has equality and equity to it, fairness. If the authority that's over the group approves positive contact and approves good dynamics, and you can feel from the authority person that is valued and appreciated and expected. When a group expects friendship and wants and strives for having connections with one another, you can see better dynamics. And it's also the best if the group is engaged in a cooperative activity in which each person can contribute. They can bring their strengths and they can bring their passions to what's being worked on. So it's not just enough to get people in the same sort of space or the same town. You need to get them on an equal footing. You need to work on the dynamic of them having equal access to group dynamics. You need to get them cooperating with one another. You need to get them anticipating that good and loyal and positive friendships could come out of it. You need to get them inspired by an authority figure that really approves of and expects positive relationships. And those things are a start. They're a start. In 1961, one of our social influence social psychologists at the time did a really classic study called The Robbers Cave. And in The Robbers Cave, it was essentially a summer camp environment. And Sharif, he was a janitor. He dressed himself up as a janitor so he could be on the campgrounds and observe all the kids. And the kids were divided into two different camps. You had the Eagles and the Rattlers. And so they start the summer camp out with essentially Eagles versus Rattlers. So one camp raids the other camp, and oh my gosh, they're just really stirring up the competition. So they even do a competition, and sort of the two teams are sort of, like warring and competing for predominance, right? And then Sharif gave them a survey of their opinions of the other camp. And right after the competition, there were a lot of negative perceptions on both sides from the Eagles and the Rattlers about the opposing team. But then what happened is they changed this tone. They created a problem that both sides of the camp needed to solve. The water tank and the water source was damaged, so we've got to work together to save the camp and save the water for the camp. And when the Eagles and the Rattlers had to work together to do a goal that they both had a contribution towards and they both had a vested interest in, you see that those negative perceptions of the other group diminished. And so this shows us again that just being around another group is not enough to take away some of those negative or competitive perceptions. Working together, cooperatively, on equal standing, on a task that we can all contribute to, and on which we feel we have a vested interest, that's really where some of those negative perceptions can diminish. A lot of prejudice and discrimination have to do with an in-group versus out-group mentality, where the in-group is us. The in-group is the Eagles, and we're the Eagles, and that's us. And the out-group is the them, right? Oh, they're the Rattlers. They're like that, right? So prejudice and discrimination and the isms have this in-group, out-group sort of feeling where the in-group has to defend itself and keep its self-esteem and keep itself intact. And that's us. That's us. That is who we are. And that in-group is often very exclusive and not inclusive in regard to the out-group. Oh, the out-group is over there. They are the other guys. They are the other camp. Well, the problem with that sort of thinking, that non-inclusive thinking, is that it divides people. It puts them as rivals instead of cooperative, potential, beautiful, diverse facets of a multifaceted life that we have. So one of the ways that we challenge prejudice, discrimination, and the isms is by expanding our idea of who the in-group is. We call this moral inclusion. So we start expanding the boundaries of our in-group. We start expanding the people that are part of us. So us is no longer just the people that vote like you. Us is all of us with our different opinions and our different values. Us is not just people that go to the same church that you do, or the same college, or wear what you wear, or look like you look, right? Us is the humans that are around you that have unique lives, unique purposes, and all of the facets of what it is to be a human and not a robot, right? So those humans have their good days. Those humans have their bad days. Those humans have things that they're still working on, and things that are consistent about themselves, and things that are not yet consistent, right? So when we expand our idea of who becomes an us and who is part of our team and the people that we care about, you'll see lower levels of prejudice, discrimination, and the isms. What would the humanistic psychologists like Maslow and Rogers say? Well, they would say that you need unconditional positive regard, empathy, and authenticity to be able to love well. And those things are muscle groups that take some time, right? That you got to flex those muscles for them to be nice and strong. So we talked about some of the things that are competitive or aggressive or not so great in regard to social dynamics. Let's now end this chapter by talking about some of the things that bring us together, love and liking. Over 50 years of research in social psychology has enabled us to know a little bit about what leads people to affiliate and like one another. And one of the most significant findings that we have about affiliation has to do with the fact that proximity and similarity are strong predictors of potential for affiliation, friendship, and liking. You are more likely to like your next door neighbor rather than someone that lives 100 miles away. There's a couple reasons why proximity is such a strong predictor of liking. Proximity gives you more exposures with another person. We call this the mere exposure effect. So the mere exposure effect is what happens when you have consistent exposures to the same stimulus or person or song or commercial or whatever it is. And over time, this neutral stimulus or thing that you didn't really have that strong of an opinion for, one way or the other, over time, a neutral stimulus can become more positive because of mere exposure. It becomes more familiar. It becomes more safe. Proximity is also important because not just exposure is at play, but also the anticipation or the potential for exposure gets us kind of excited and positively expecting to see that person. And so proximity has both exposure and the anticipation of exposure. Another thing that predicts liking is when another person likes us. We tend to like people that like us. One is that when someone likes us, we feel like we need to reciprocate or return the favor. But also when someone likes us, it creates a climate of expectancy. They like us, those positive nonverbals come my way, and I behave in kind towards that person. So both reciprocity and the power of expectation are at play there. Another factor in regard to liking is another really strong one, and that has to do with similarity. We like people that like us, and we also like people that are like us. So they're slightly different, if you can kind of see the directionality there. When you find out that my favorite band is the same as yours, or I voted the same way, or we came up from similar towns, or we go to the same school, when you find similarity with another person, it's like a hooray. You know, your brain does this thing that connects you. Part of the reason it connects you is something called consensual validation. When someone else's interests are the same as ours, they validate ours. So when I find out that you value something that I value, it ends up adding value to that thing that I already value. And through all of this, we see that liking and affiliation and friendship, more liking usually leads to more liking, because as you like me and I like you, and we go in this back and forth cycle of finding things that we can be close about, or things that we can spend time together doing, or things that we have in common. As we do those things, oftentimes people will increase their level of liking or affiliation. But how would a social psychologist explain friendship? Well, a social psychologist would say that friendship often involves proximity, mutual liking, similarity, and consensual validation. So let's take that liking and move it into a loving direction. Let's take it into love. So what would a social psychologist say about love? Well, a social psychologist would describe love as an intense connection and intimacy between two people that often starts with maybe some strong emotions or some passionate emotions or some physical attractions. But also early on, it's operating on something called the social exchange principle or social exchange theory. That early on in a loving relationship, we tend to sort of see people and value the reciprocity. Like, okay, he took me to dinner and then I took him to a baseball game. And we kind of go back and forth at first as we try to have an equal exchange of sort of who's giving and who's giving and who's getting and who's getting. We want to do this in such a way as to maximize our benefits and minimize our consequences or costs. But as love grows more mature, we see something else at play. And in social psychology, we would call this the investment model. And that has to do with some of the factors that involve maturity and stability and commitment in a relationship. And so people that switch over into investment mode, they're not keeping a record of how many times they've said, I love you. Like, I said it twice and the other person has said it once. So I'm not keeping a spreadsheet anymore. In the investment model, what I'm really focusing on is commitment, investment, long-term connection, long-term productivity. And oftentimes that's easier when I'm in a situation that is more focused on my partner and less on the external temptations. So although love might start out quite emotional or passionate or romantic or maybe even physical, where I'm keeping a record of kind of who did what and when, hopefully and diligently over time, what happens with love is that it becomes more stable, more mature, stronger in a different way, more committed, more invested, more wise. And it's not keeping a record of wrongs anymore. It's not keeping a tally of who did what. It is gracious and forgiving and flexible. But I hope for you guys that wherever this video finds you, that you've got loving relationships. And if some of those relationships aren't as healthy as they could be, I strongly suggest that you work on it. You work on it with the help of an outsider. You work on it with the help of people that can see the situation clearly. And hey, maybe there is a loving relationship that you haven't met yet that is just around the corner. So work on yourself until that time comes, right? So this leads us to the tail end of the chapter. And I think a really good wrap up to the chapter has to do with the so what. We've talked about a lot of things in regard to social thinking, social influence, and social relationships. I think one of the biggest so whats of social psychology is pro-social behavior, or behavior that's intended to help and not hurt other people. Now, I'm a huge fan of compassion and generosity and altruism. So, altruism is unselfish helping, essentially helping someone else even if it costs you or is a consequence to you. You know, and some in the psychological literature are going to question whether or not that's possible. How can you help someone else in a pure way? Sometimes people help because they get a benefit out of helping. That would be egoism. They help others for personal gain. So I'll do your laundry, but I'm expecting you to wash my car, right? So I'm helping, but only because I'm getting out of it, right? We just have to go back and forth on this reciprocity norm. Helping actually does often make a person feel better. There is something called the do-good, feel-good effect. So despite the fact that helping has biological, psychological, and sociocultural factors, I do think it's possible to have compassion and altruism that is purely motivated. And I think that your favorite superhero probably shows some altruism or something great about them, right? Don't the people that we look up to, don't our heroes show some level of consequence and self-sacrifice and pure-hearted motive? The motive to help and save and redeem. So as we end this chapter, and as we end our walk through the basic concepts of social psychology, I'm calling all my superheroes. I'm calling you out. There's a hero inside of you. There's something great about you. And if you've got something great plus a pure motive, you're unstoppable. All right, my superheroes, it was an awesome time with you today. Next week's chapter covers chapter 15, and we're going to be talking about some of the clinical aspects of human nature, some of the things that involve some rough places for us. And we're going to talk about them in such a way as we leave knowing more about the human condition. And so I want you to take care of yourself this week. This is definitely your homework within the homework. I want you to take care of yourself. I want you to show some good self-care. I want you to have some good sleep. I want you to start studying early and not procrastinating on stuff. And I want you to reach out to loving and safe other people to share what you're going through. You did a great job today, you guys. Congratulations. I will see you next week.